I wanted to introduce the subject today. I just want to talk a little bit about philanthropy, but let's start with the core question of why are there nonprofits at all? And in order to explore that question, I'd like to offer up a theory. And it starts off by looking at the spectrum of economic activities. And at one end of the spectrum, over on the left, are those things where you can clearly make some money. And that's the realm of business. And over here are things that are simply not possible to make money off of, not possible to make a profit. And that tends to be the stuff that we, so the realm of business is that it's clearly profitable, and the realm of government, the things that we ask government to do, are things that are clearly not profitable. And the reason that's important, there's a boundary there. Business is always trying to push out to figure out what it can do to make money off of things. And depending on the philosophy of a particular jurisdiction, whether it's a state or a city or a country, the boundary between what government does and does not do is permeable and flexible. And so the reason that's important is because right there, smack dab in the middle, is why we have nonprofits. It's to do those things that business can't make money off of, and those things that government chooses not to make money or chooses not to do. So, and that boundary is always moving. We've got, due to innovation, changes in philosophy, these boundaries are always going to move. But basically, I'd like you to hold that theory in mind for just a second. Where does the money come from to fund those activities that you can't make profit off of? Well, it comes basically from two places: people and business, either in the form of taxes going from business or individuals to the government, or in the form of philanthropy. It goes from charitable businesses and organizations and people who want to sponsor philanthropic efforts. And then, of course, there's also some governmental grants that come back in. We're entering into a period of lower taxes due to the tax bill that was passed a few months ago. And so the question, one of the major questions for nonprofits is, what will happen to philanthropy? And that's one of the reasons we're all here today. So I think the reason I offer this up is there's just a basic point here. And that if you think about this spectrum, there's one measure that really matters, and that's profit, more precisely financial profit, what's on your P&L. And if you think you can make money off of it, then it falls into the realm of business. If no government may or may not provide it, and if government doesn't do it, and if business can't make money off of it, then it's going to fall into the realm of the nonprofits. Or else it's going to fall between the cracks. So I'd like to build on, make a couple observations off of this. First of all, that business tends to be transaction-oriented, and finance in particular is transaction-oriented. It's deal-oriented. If it makes a buck, then you keep doing it. If it doesn't make a buck, then you put it out of its misery. The second observation, just to go back to the fundamental piece, is nonprofits and government exist because they are how we provide goods and services that people need and want that you can't make money off of. And I would argue to you that when we talk about running business or nonprofits like a government or nonprofits like a business, we're actually setting them up for failure because they are fundamentally designed to do something that they cannot do, which is make a profit. And so if that's the case, if we are talking about running government or nonprofit as a business, even though we know it can't do what a business is supposed to do, then it really is putting an awful lot of strain and stress on top of those businesses, or on top of the government, or on top of the nonprofit. And particularly because then we start applying the tools of business, the metrics that we have, the tools that we use, to something that it isn't necessarily a very good fit. And building on that, I think we also need a different perspective. And what I'm not saying here is that any organization, public, private, or nonprofit, should be run inefficiently. I'm saying that it ought to have the appropriate tools for whatever it is trying to achieve, or by extension, not trying to achieve. So, the final piece of that is if we have these organizations, governments and nonprofits that by definition are not going to make a profit, then how do we judge it? I think that's a fundamental question that we as a society haven't really very effectively addressed. And I think it's one that we need to address, because what we're doing as a default is using the tools and the mindset of business, the transaction orientation, if you will, to judge something that isn't necessarily transaction oriented, that isn't necessarily profit oriented. And I think that creates a tremendous tension. So, how do we go about measuring this unprofitable success, if you will? Well, I think the best tool we have is it's somewhat analogous to the concept of goodwill on a balance sheet. But because goodwill is not regularly measured and not frequently measured, that's a very crude tool, but it's sort of the best we have right now. So let's go back to this question, the fundamental question of why do we need nonprofits in government? Well, arguably it's because the activities of daily living, and we'll look at business in particular, create externalities. And what we're doing is we're asking government and nonprofits to sort of sweep up the mess behind it. So whether it's environmental issues like the pollution that's caused by industry or by cars or by what have you, or whether it's social related things, such as the not being able to have a living wage from a particular job. There are all these externalities that are created, and that's the stuff that we're piling upon government and nonprofits to try to address. And I would argue to you that if we could eliminate externalities, if we could move these lines over so that business is actually covering a lot of those, then we'd be able to eliminate much of the need for nonprofits, government, and taxes. That's my theoretical world. But we're not living in a theoretical world. We're living in the world of today, and until we get to that point, we're going to need government, we're going to need nonprofits, and by extension, we're going to need taxes, and we're going to need philanthropy in order to make things work. So, with that, let me switch into part two, which is, what do we know about philanthropy in Teton County, Wyoming? The IRS tax data go back to 1991. And the most current is 2015. And the measures they gave us from 1991 through the year 2009 were pretty crude. They gave us basically just 6 measurements. How many tax returns? How many exemptions? What was the adjusted gross income? How much of that was from wages? And how much of that was from different types of investments? So if you go back to 1991 and you look at the number of tax returns filed in Teton County, Wyoming, there were about 7,000 filed in that year. And in 2015, we about doubled that. That rate of growth was about 3 times faster than the number of returns being filed by American citizens as a whole, or residents of America. Our income has grown about 10 times over what it was in 1991. And comparing that to what's happened with the national income, we've grown, again, more than 3 times faster than the national income. And if you look at it on a per return basis, or per capita basis, if you will, our income today is almost 4 times that. Our mean income off of each tax return is almost 4 times that of the nation. 25 years ago, it was 50% more. So we've gotten very, very wealthy in a relatively short period of time. Why? Because of investment income. Our wage income has grown at about the pace of the population growth, but our investment income has gone from where it was about matching our wages in 1991 to where it's 3 or 4 times greater than our wage-based income right now. That's very different than the nation as a whole. And as a result, since 2010, the IRS has reported income out by income brackets. And the highest one they have is over $200,000. And so if you look at all of the income that was reported on a per return basis by those people those households making under $200,000. The mean income was about $47,000. This was the average between 2010 and 2015. During that same 6-year stretch, the average income for those Teton County residents making over $200,000 was $2 million a year more. What's really interesting is that if you look at those households that are making $200,000 or less, we are very, very similar to the nation as a whole. The nation as a whole made about $46,000. We made about $47,000 per household, the average for those 6 years. And the split was pretty similar too. The nation as a whole made 72% of its money off of wages, roughly 3/4, as did we. If you break it out a little bit more and you just look at those folks making those households between $100,000 and $200,000, again, the figures are almost identical. $135,000 for U.S. households, $138,000 for Teton County. What you can see, though, is that the split is starting to happen where we become more dependent. People who are making $100,000 or more are becoming more dependent on investment income. Why is that important? Because as the stock market goes, so does the income. If Wyoming rises and falls on the price of coal, our local income very much rises and falls on what's going on in the stock market, which means that when we get the tax returns for 2017 and the way 2018 is going, we should be doing very, very well indeed. Where things really go crazy when you compare us to the United States as a whole, for all those households in the United States that were making $200,000 or more, the mean income for those the average income per year for those 6 years was $500,000. We were $2.3 million for our average household income. We're making a lot of money. How are we spending it? Where's it going? Well, if you look at the United States as a whole, 14% on taxes, we were paying 20% on taxes because we have a much higher income. We were putting 6% of our money into charitable donations, though, versus 2% for the nation as a whole. Let's break that down a little bit. Again, this is back to those households making $200,000 or less. Very, very similar in terms of tax rates, in terms of charitable donations and amount of money left over. There's a very different story being told, however, with our well-to-do people. What's interesting is that for people making, excuse me, I got this wrong. This is over $200,000. I mislabeled it. Both are taking home about 3/4 of what they have after the charitable contributions and taxes. Because of Wyoming's favorable tax rates, though, our well-to-do people are paying a lower overall tax rate, even though they're making a lot more money. They're putting twice as much as a percentage of their income into charitable giving, though. And this is based on deductions, so it's an apples-to-apples kind of thing, but it's what's being reported as deductions on their tax returns. So again, 21%, we have a lower tax rate, even though we're making almost 5 times as much money, and we're putting twice as much into charitable giving. The big bottom line is if you look at IRS giving data for the deductions for charitable giving, those households making $200,000 or more, which are roughly 15% of all the residents in Teton County, account for 97% of all the deductions of all the charitable giving. Before you go pinning your hopes completely on that particular demographic, though, there's an awful lot of fluctuation within that. Again, that was a 6-year average. In 2011, the folks making a lot of money in our community gave under 4% of their total adjusted gross income to charitable giving. Another year, in 2010, it was up over 11%. So there are wide swings in the amount of giving among our charitably minded, well-to-do people. The shortcomings, when you try to pick this further apart, you can look at the IRS data and you can say how much they gave away in charitable giving, but we don't know where that went. We have no way of knowing where that went. What we can do, the only thing that we have as sort of a proxy for that is old bills. And the green line down below is the match each year, and the black line are the donations. And the little magenta dots fuchsia dots are the donations divided by the match. So basically it's around 2.5 to 3 times what it was. The issue there is, of course, we have no way of being able to break that down by income category either. So we can make these broad generalizations, but we can't talk specifically about what's going on in terms of specifics. So, a few takeaways. The first is, until we eliminate externalities or vastly expand government, there will always be a need for nonprofits. And I believe that while all organizations should be run efficiently, we are really doing a disservice to government and our nonprofits by trying to run them as businesses if we bring that business transaction and make a profit mentality to it. The second big takeaway from my research is that our non-wealthy are basically the same as America's non-wealthy. And that includes all of those in the brackets leading up to $200,000 a year or less in income. Our wealthy, however, are very, very different than the wealthy in the nation as a whole. They make about 5 times as much money on average. They give away about twice as much of that money that they make as a percentage of their income. Again, though, we aren't able to tell exactly where it went. Looking more closely at our well-to-do residents, they clearly benefit from Wyoming's tax situation. Even with 5 times the income, they have a lower average tax rate. But they sure compensate with it by having about twice as much in their charitable giving. While we can't tell precisely how much giving is done locally, the evidence abounds that we are giving off a huge percentage of it. If you look at whether it's the Craig Thomas Visitor Center, or the Center for the Arts, or the other wonderful capital facilities we have, if you look at nearly $150 million given to old bills, we are clearly benefiting from a philanthropic culture. But the question is, if we lose interest if the new wealth that's coming into the community loses interest in that, if there's a different kind of mindset, if there's a shift in that, what's going to happen to this philanthropic largesse, which we clearly need because we live in a limited government, limited tax kind of situation in Wyoming, of course. And if that's the case, and we have problems that we're looking to the nonprofit sector to solve, then we're clearly going to be needing that. So, with all that, if it's important for us to maintain a culture of philanthropy, then I think it's also important to have a better understanding into what our well-to-do residents think. And with that, I'd like to transition to my friend and colleague, Justin Farrell. 3 years ago, about this time in The Economist magazine, there was an op-ed that began, "The most original political book of early 2015 is not actually a book about politics at all. Instead, The Battle for Yellowstone by Justin Farrell, a young scholar at Yale University, provides new, damn it, I need my glasses.
Don't we all?
Excuse me. ponders venomous rows that have shaken Yellowstone National Park in recent decades and why they are so intractable. The rows turn on such questions as wolf reintroduction, bison roaming rights, and snowmobile access to that lovely corner of the northern Rockies. Well, reading that, I recognized a good thing, and so I jumped on the opportunity to make Justin's acquaintance, and over the last few years, I've become lucky enough to come to consider him both a friend and a colleague. He's out here this week with his class on a 1 week during Yale spring break, where they're touring around the greater Yellowstone and taking a look at things. And for the last 3-4 years, Justin, he's been looking at the well-to-do in Jackson Hole, and he'll tell you a little bit about his findings and about some of the research he's doing. He's got another book coming out next year, about a year. And so, Valley Bookstore, and I'm sure that he'll gladly take pre-orders for those of you who want to know more about it when the time comes. So we're going to do a quick computer trade out, and then Justin's going to talk. So thank you very much. A couple of quick questions. Charlie?
Yeah, just a quick one, Jonathan. A comparison on the spending of the very rich in the U.S. and internationally, say, with Western Europe. My understanding is that the charitable contributions here in the U.S. are considerably higher because of the lower taxes.
The question was, how do American wealthy spend their money as far as charitable giving versus those in Western Europe? I have no idea. The assumption behind the question was that because the folks in Western Europe are taxed higher, then they give less to charitable giving. You said it with authority. I believe you. I have no idea. Justin, you want to come up and swap?